Well, good morning officially, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. And as I'm seeing your names, thank you also for being part of this project, which I know that Maria will talk about as she goes through. But you all have helped guide the drafting, the writing of our Survivor Housing Action Plan. And so it is because of you all that we're here today. So I'm very grateful. I'm Greta Hagen, as I think I know most or all of you. I'm the Director of Development and External Relations here at Jane Doe Inc. And I would like to introduce or really reintroduce to you all, since I think most of you know her, Maria Williams Howard from Framework Strategies, who has been working with us as our housing consultant, and confidant and friend and troublemaker in partnership for this last year-ish and a bit. And so I will hand it over to Maria. She's going to walk us through how the action plan came to be and what it means for our work, and I think what happens next, because really it is a blueprint and some marching orders. So I will turn it over to Maria.
Thanks so much, Greta. It's so great to be here with you all today. I feel like this day has been a long time coming, and so I'm really glad that we're all here to talk through the Survivor Housing Action Plan and to really think through what the next steps are for Massachusetts. And I feel like I'm really trying to reframe my thinking around this. This could not be more timely because if there were ever a time that communities like ours needed to have a plan, it's now. So I'm really grateful that you all are ahead of the curve, which, as we're going to talk about, is really common for Massachusetts. So that's exciting. So as Greta said, my name is Maria, and I'm your housing consultant and have been with you all for a little over a year and have so enjoyed working with you all and will continue to be with you through this year. And I I think that in this next year we're going to see an incredible amount of change within the housing field, and I'm really honored to be walking with you all through that process. And as Greta also said, causing as much trouble as we possibly can to make sure that survivors continue to get the resources they need. And I really also want to thank you all for the engagement that you've had within this plan. Those of you that are able to attend today, I know that many of you came to listening sessions and reviewed material for me and let me pick your brains, and I'm so grateful for that. For those of you that are listening to this later, I want to thank you for the time that you spent, the commitment that you have. I think that that was one of the universal things that I heard and felt from everyone that I talked to is that there was no amount of talking anybody into the idea that housing was important for survivors. You all have bought into this concept and know from the coalition, through all member programs, through so many of your community partners, that this is where you need to spend time, invest resources, and really grow and learn. And I'm so excited to be in this process with you. So I am a housing consultant that works specifically in the gender-based violence field. I've been in the gender-based violence field for over 20 years and used to work at the community program level and previously worked at a state housing coalition or a state gender-based violence coalition, but have always worked at the intersection of housing homelessness and survivor needs. So I come from a long history of setting up different housing modalities in different structures that survivors need and different political climates and different um, times when different finances were available. And so I think that that is really where we need to focus today. And so I don't have a particularly long presentation for you all because I know that you all have received the action plan and we're going to walk through it. But what I really would love to do is take some time to hear from you all and be able to answer any questions about the process. And then Hema and Greta are here and allow them to answer any questions that you may have about JDI's next steps. Um, and then we can go from there. All right. So, the development of JDI's housing agenda really started about a year ago. I know that um, a number of you have been involved in this process from about that point. But uh, and that JDI and those of you that have worked across the state in Massachusetts have really been engaged in housing work for decades. And I think that that is what has made this work of like figuring out, helping you all establish what's next for you, far easier and far more streamlined than I think it could be in a lot of communities. A lot of times when consultants like myself come in and try to help do a safe housing assessment, which is what this sort of thing is often called, and this is a pretty scaled down version of what those could be. Um, it is like you need to go in and change every step of the system to actually make it safe or more attuned to what survivors need. But what is wonderful is in Massachusetts, thanks to the long advocacy work that you all and JDI have engaged in, um, housing in Massachusetts is far more geared to survivors' needs than what it is in most states. I am not saying that is enough. It is nowhere near. But it is far more than what most communities experience, and it is far more rooted in your community than what most communities have, which I think is really exciting because it sets you up so well in times like you're experiencing currently. So when I say the groundwork started in December, what I mean is this current agenda. You all have been laying the groundwork for many years. We began listening sessions, and we'll talk about those in February. Listening sessions included member programs, also key stakeholders. So, not just member programs, but also some folks in your community that are very engaged in housing development, housing ideas for survivors. We then took some time and synthesized information and took learnings that we had and then shared some initial findings in May. And that was information that was shared back to all of you, and then did some prioritization work with some of you, and then developed the plan through basically this past summer. And then sat with the team at JDI, did some review, and then shared out the final draft or the final version of the Housing Action Plan in October. So all of you should have received that. If you haven't received that, please let us know and we can definitely get a copy of that to you. So takes you through the timeline of how we designed the project, and I want to make sure that you can understand like how it was designed because I think that that's an important part of the process. I also want to make sure that you can still see my screen.
We can see your screen, Maria. Is it possible to make the slide you're on a little bigger? We see all of the slides in the current view. I don't know if
Oh,
that's like the whole slideshow. It, it is visible if not, but it could be a little bigger if possible.
yes, I'm sorry. One moment. This is the problem with two screens.
And if not, it was totally seeable, but if possible, that would be cool.
I got this pop-up and I was like, something's happening.
I also ignore pop-ups, so solidarity. Like that.
How's
Yes, it's
that?
beautiful. It's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for letting me know. All right. So in the timeline, we started doing in March individual listening sessions with different regions across the state. I wanted to let you know that the largest listening sessions that we held were in Western Massachusetts, and in the greater Boston area. I think that makes sense. The greater Boston area is also obviously the most populated area of the state, and so we had the largest turnout there. In Western Massachusetts, we covered sort of the largest land area of the state, and so we had the most folks come in from different regions. What I think was so interesting is we heard so many of the same things over and over and over, though, regardless of where folks lived across the state. So many of the same themes around engagement with continuum of care funding, engagement around finding affordable housing, engagement around landlord support and finding landlords that are willing to work with survivors. And also, really thinking and talking about what are the best long-term strategies for survivors when they are in emergency shelter and then want to and need to find safe housing options that are going to last for them. Um, there are not many options that survivors are eligible for, but in that sort of range of options, where do survivors do best, and how can we really make sure that we're setting survivors up for success? The conversations were incredible, and I think helped us learn so much about Massachusetts, about where you all are, and about what you really need from JDI, and how they can best support you in the work moving forward. I think that getting to know the community like this has really been helpful, and the pieces that I think were really missing from this is more engagement with community stakeholders, aside from just a few of the interviews that I did at the beginning. What we found is that the further we got into this timeline, the more disruption we saw at the federal level. And so it became more and more challenging to engage folks because you all were engaged in the real work, and that is where you needed to be, as were your community partners. I think that in times of distress, it really is challenging to step back and think and talk about where you need to be and where you want to go. Um, all the same, as we said at the start, it's really, really great that you have a plan and a thought about how you want to move forward. Um, the other key piece that I think that is missing here that I think some really great follow-up could happen is listening sessions with survivors. Um, I think that one thing we heard from you all without doubt is that you all are very attuned to what survivors' needs are because you talk with survivors in your programs and you ask them and you build programs around the feedback that you're receiving from survivors. And we also know that there's a lot of benefit and best practice around meeting with survivors and taking the time to do that. And in a typical safe housing assessment, that is something that would be included. That was not included in this, and definitely something I would recommend moving forward. So, some of your system strengths is where I wanted to start. I have worked in a number of states and I have done and been involved in assessments in a number of states. And I want to tell you that I have seen few states that you have multiple sectors at the state level that are as engaged in and prioritized around survivor housing, as in Massachusetts. Um, I was so impressed that the governor's office is as involved and engaged as they are, that mass housing has such a deep understanding, that there are folks that are really deeply embedded in your work in ways that you don't have to tell them why they need to be, which I think is so unique and so lovely. All that said, I also know that there are deep holes, and we'll talk about those. But on the whole, I really was so impressed and grateful to see about the engagement that you have across your state. And I also think that that sets an incredible precedent for other entities across the state that you do want to engage. Um, I think that there's an ongoing precedent too of regional gatherings that JDI and that member programs just create on their own to make sure that they can share information and collaborate and coordinate in ways that are best for survivors. There are times I think that in states, particularly in larger states, I guess that folks can get really uh, territorial, for lack of a better word, around resources. And that can often lead to folks pulling apart and moving away from each other rather than coming together and figuring out how to best coordinate. And what we saw over and over is that, particularly regionally, there's so much great coordination happening. And it's also really incredible when it's not your state coalition that's saying you need to coordinate, but it's the folks on the ground that are in the member programs that are saying, we're going to coordinate. And JDI, if you would like to join us, you're welcome. I think that that's really where the power of our movement comes from, is folks on the ground being willing to coordinate and collaborate and move and make change for survivors. And that's what we saw over and over and over again in Massachusetts. You also provide incredible peer support to each other. I have seen few things like it. You're so willing to call each other and just say like, oh my gosh, this wild thing happened, and I need you to talk me through what happened for you because I think something similar happened. I need you to help me navigate this system that I know you're an expert in. And also the willingness that many of your colleagues have to say, I navigated this system and now I want to talk to you about it because I think that my experiences are going to benefit you. Last week, we held a continuum of care crash course, and a couple of your colleagues joined and provided their expertise. And honestly, like your colleagues have provided their expertise to me through this entire process, and it has been invaluable. The amount that I have learned has been incredible. And that is so valuable and rare, and I think something to really capitalize on. Because of that expertise that exists, you also have a lot of national partners that are looking to Massachusetts to say, like, what are you doing there that works well? Because clearly, like, there's something in the sauce that's great, right? So you have national partners saying, what are you doing with emergency transfers, and how can we get in on that and help? And so at HUD, there is a gender-based violence office, and they have looked at the potential for emergency transfers in Massachusetts, and they want to learn from you and grow the work nationally based on what is happening in Massachusetts, which I think is incredible. And that's just one example. I think there's also a history of creativity in looking at, you know, not everything has to stay in the box that our federal partners are saying it needs to stay in. And so how can we take this resource and use it as creatively as possible? The voucher system that exists throughout Massachusetts is a good example of that. We also know that it could be more flexible than it is, but it is a good example. And then finally, and I think likely where you have the greatest strength as a community, is prioritizing the folks that need this the most. We've seen over and over this systematic oppression of undocumented people and queer people. And what we saw in Massachusetts is undocumented people and queer people and people of color being centered over and over and over again as the survivors that need resources the most. And that regardless of what is being said at the federal level, that those are the individuals that you all want to continue to serve. And that needs to be celebrated every day. So incredible work. And again, I'm so honored to be a part of it. So I wanted to share a little bit of the high level and statewide themes and key concepts that we found. And these are pulled from the listening sessions, from the interviews, from conversations that we had with JDI staff, from conversations that we had with different teams and different organizations about really what is most needed around the state, where JDI could invest resources and have the most impact. These were the common themes that we heard. Resource coordination was a huge one. It does feel like there are many paths to resources in Massachusetts, and knowing how to best access those resources is like finding a treasure map sometimes. And having that decoded would be real helpful. Um, there was a continual ask for training. And this is something that is, every community that I work with, this is a continual ask. And where we really heard this clear is it's both for new advocates that come on or advocates that are working in your programs that need a refresher, but also for your community partners. So, first of all, you don't have to be the ones that train them necessarily because you have jobs that are important. But also because they are out there making all kinds of decisions, and it can be really tricky to have to hold community partners accountable. You need to value those relationships, and you need to make sure that your relationships with community partners stay intact so survivors can get resources. If you have to be the entity as a community program that says over and over again, hey, housing authority, you are continually violating VAWA housing protections. And these are all of the problems over and over and over again. I know from personal experience that housing authority is going to be less and less likely to work with you, which means fewer survivors are going to be housed. But if you can engage your state coalition to be the entity that you can call them and say, hey, I need you to reach out to this housing authority because they're violating VAWA in these different ways. And I tried to have a conversation. It didn't go well. I'm really worried about housing survivors. I need you to be worried about making sure that community partners understand VAWA. Can you take that on? Allowing state coalitions to do that work, I think can really, really be beneficial to folks on the ground. Um, and then that goes hand in hand with the idea of technical assistance. So making sure that coalitions can engage in that work and then provide you ongoing information about the changing landscape of housing and how to best provide housing support to survivors. Um, there are a number of different options here, connection to funding, also really working with continuums of care and other HUD entities to make sure that they understand the importance of housing survivors, the vulnerabilities that survivors experience, and how to really account for those vulnerabilities. Um, we heard often that like your organizations have gone to the leads of continuums of care over and over and over again and said that that survivors are not being accounted for, and all of this work is really that you have done is really not taking hold because the folks that are in leadership at the continuum of care are not hearing you in the way that you need to be heard, and that was a pretty common theme. Um, I think too, relationship building was a huge theme, making sure that there are open lines of communication, that you know who to reach out to, um, and that you're also supported with legislative advocacy. This was something that we heard without doubt that JDI is doing incredibly well and that they have a long history of doing incredibly well. Um, I know, JDI's economic justice work and advocacy is phenomenal. I know that coalitions across the country look at it as an example. And I think that you all have taken really incredible note as to how impactful that can be for housing survivors. And we heard over and over that continuing that work and growing that work is really important. So those are the themes we heard sort of across the state. From those themes, we pulled these three recommendations. So before I move into these three recommendations, what I want to tell you is that in the report, I highlighted this, but due to the current federal and state funding climate, what what we're recommending is that JDI focus on sort of the goals of the that we identified as these high level themes to work on over the next number of years. That if these high level themes are broken down into actionable steps and ways to really move forward, that these steps will really answer sort of the call of the member programs. And that's the most important thing that can be done right now. But we also did really want to honor what member programs were asking for, even though because of the national and state budget situations, honestly, it is not possible to move forward in the way that, had originally been hoped, or in sort of like these pie like best case scenario situations that we did want to pull from the interviews and listening sessions. So when I say that these are the recommendations from the member programs, this is if everything was best case scenario, that if the federal funding were intact, if state funding were intact, if increases were on the horizon or had already occurred, um, if we didn't feel like we were at every turn putting out fires, these sorts of things. This would be your sort of like dream scenario. Um, so those three things are a regional or statewide landlord project. We heard a lot of information about needing to connect with landlords and needing to make sure that coordination um, made sense and was based on best practice. We also heard a call from almost everyone about the need for development of an online space that JDI would host that include trainings and resources with up-to-date information in one easy to access location. We heard over and over and over again that like you had to go to one place to get an application for CHAMP, and you had to go to another place to get an application for this thing, and another place to get an application for this thing, and another place to do this. And it was so time consuming to even remember where a survivor had even applied, that it was almost impossible to move someone on into permanent housing. And we know that the system should never be the thing that limits someone's ability to be housed. And as I say that, I understand how ironic that is given our current situation, but um, what what we want to know from you all is the best ways to make sure that the system can flow to have this be as easy for survivors as possible. And one of those ways was what we decided. One of you, I think, in the Greater Boston session termed this the housing hub, which we really liked. So we decided to call it that. So this is one of those key learnings, I think, that like information needs to be in one place, it needs to be easy to access, and it needs to be continually updated. And that would be a huge benefit to the community. And then the final thing that we heard was about dedicated staff. And the key learnings from this recommendation really came around the idea that member programs wanted to know who at JDI they needed to ask questions to, that they wanted to know they were asking the right person. They also wanted to know that they could feel confident about reaching out to JDI, that their questions would be answered, not that their questions aren't answered, but that they weren't like they I heard from you all that you were very aware of how busy the folks are at JDI, and so you wanted to be really intentional about your outreach. Um, and then ultimately, the idea that if there was a dedicated staff person, it really would signal to you all JDI's ongoing commitment and investment to survivor housing. So again, I just want to say that these are your ideal recommendations. These are not necessarily the recommendations that are going to be able to be implemented by JDI in the upcoming year or even in the upcoming years. But we did want you to have this information. So in in a number of years when you're hopefully still using this document to be able to inform where you're going next, you can look at it and say, like, this was the idea. Is this still applicable? How do we want to move it forward? So we talked a little bit about the limitations around these ideas, and first of all, um, housing work for survivors is iterative and it's ever changing. What I have learned over the years is that as soon as you understand a system, that system changes. I think that you could say that for any system, but I can speak particularly to the housing system that it is wildly and unnecessarily complex. And so having then one individual that is sort of leading that can be really problematic because oftentimes the demand is far greater than one full-time employee at a coalition can hold. Um, we've seen different examples of that, and really like when you can take the work of engaging member programs across the state with survivor housing expertise and look at that creatively, you often can have um, a better outcome because you're not looking at one person to hold all that information. And then we've talked about state and federal budget cuts, and I think that that's pretty obvious and incredibly detrimental to our movement right now and likely for years to come. And so looking at how we can balance that reality with the fact that survivors need us now more than they ever have. And so, how do we move forward leads us to possibilities. So one of the things that these are the possibilities really come from recommendations that myself and my colleagues have seen work over the years and have helped implement in other areas in other states and would recommend for Massachusetts. The first is some sort of online communication tool. I know that folks are using Slack and different tools like that. I'm not sure what would work best. I think that would be something that would need to be um, talked through. But one of the things that we heard is that it would be really great to be able to just have send a quick message out to people to say, hey, can somebody please explain this application to me? And then know that on the other end of that were other folks that understood the question you were asking, because as we've talked about many times, the housing world uses a whole different set of language than the gender-based violence world. And so there was no like need for interpretation, no need for like, this is why I'm asking the question. None of that. Just a quick, like, could you please explain this to me? Knowing then that there were a group of individuals that you were communicating with from other JDI member programs. Um, and potentially like myself as a consultant or other consultants you may engage or other folks from JDI that have the capacity, whatever that may look like, that would be able to support in answering those quick technical assistance questions. The other thing that we would recommend is regional expert work groups. You all are already doing this to some extent. Particularly we saw examples of this in the West. Um, Getting together and deciding what is going to be best for your region and then helping implement that is some of the best work you can do right now. I think that really getting down to the local level, and finding out what those local needs are, and then making sure that you as a collective are able to implement those local needs is some of the best work that can be done. I also know that work in rural and suburban areas is wildly different than work in urban areas. And that includes experiences of survivors and experiences with housing and housing instability. And so knowing that you could come together as a community and be able to problem solve and discuss around situations that you're going to experience as like situations is really important right now. And I couldn't recommend highly enough. The other thing that we would recommend is a JDI housing committee. I'm not sure what your committee structure is like for JDI, but one of the things we heard is that the importance of JDI sort of signaling that housing is important. One of the things that a coalition can do is establish a work group internally or a committee internally to signal that. That would be then an internal group that would make sure in within the governance structure that would ensure that this work would continue. Um, Also, in regard to governance structures, and this is tangential, we would also recommend that there be DVSA committees within the governance structures of continuums of care, and that there be DVSA advocates on the boards of housing authorities and other entities such as those, to ensure that governance of those entities is informed by our movement also. Um, we heard the definite need for in-person gatherings. So important right now, when we are all sort of put in a position where we're fighting for the same scraps. These are the moments where we're really pulled apart, and there's nothing more important we could do than come together. And so ensuring that you're able to be together and be in person and spend time is incredibly important. And there's um, going to be great benefit that comes from that. That would obviously be a learning time together, but it would also be sort of a commiserating time and a time for planning and a time for action. We also think that developing a landlord project, and whether that's statewide or not, I'm not sure of how that will work best, but developing a landlord project on either a state or regional basis, where some tools are provided that can be rolled out and support you all with landlord engagement, I think would be incredibly beneficial. Um, Working with your continuums of care right now is going to be also incredibly beneficial. So moving on to the next, advocacy and relationship facilitation. We heard a lot, as I mentioned before, that oftentimes communication with your continuums of care is sort of not moving forward in the way that you need it to, and allowing the continuum or allowing JDI to support that relationship will be very important. ongoing legislative advocacy. This is something, again, where we've talked about JDI excels and where you all have identified the JDI excels. And so we want to recommend that that continues and is supported. And then the final recommendation that we would give is the idea of housing first for sexual and domestic violence survivors implemented across the state. There's a whole write-up on housing first in the document that we produced. But housing first is the idea that survivors have access to the type of housing that meets their needs with no prerequisites to that housing. Um, this is already something that you do incredibly well. But the idea of the flexible funding, the landlord and community engagement, and the mobile advocacy, which are sort of the three pillars of Housing First, is a really great modality of service and practice to um, allow housing work across Massachusetts for survivors to be a bit more uniform. And when I say that, I know that everywhere that you are, housing work needs to be tailored to the specific community that you're in. But what we also heard is that there was a real call for how do we do this best? How do we provide housing to survivors best? And what we know is that Housing First is one of the tested modalities of service and housing provision that has been recommended at the federal level since 2009 and has only very, very recently been rescinded, and that it has been tested for survivors and is one of the few with the changes that I spoke of in the three sort of prongs of service um, has really been modified for survivors and has and works. And there's data that backs that up. We've got very few of those things in the sort of the cross section of survivor need and housing first for SADV survivors is one of them. And I I cannot recommend it highly enough. I think that it will ground you all in practice that many of you already do. In fact, the vast majority of you already do. And it will allow you to have strategies to move folks from emergency housing options into permanent housing options in ways that make sense. It will allow you to speak to funders in ways that will give you more confidence. And it will allow you to have means of communication across the state where you're all using similar language to talk about how you're working with survivors and how housing is happening across the state. So again, these are my recommendations. They're not things that you have to do, obviously, but they are things that I've seen work and make significant differences in other communities. And so I can't recommend them highly enough. Finally, we ended the publication that we gave you with some specific training options. Um, Again, one of the things we heard throughout is that there was such a need for training. This is a really, really great jumping off spot because we want to make sure that everybody has access to the same information, is using similar language, can really like be able to have the similar conversations, have confidence in those conversations. A great way to do that is through training. So some of these have already happened, which is great. JDI is going to be prioritizing and thinking through these trainings and how they can be done. The trainings that I will be supporting with are going to be recorded. Some of them won't even be live trainings. They'll just be things that I'll share and record, and then JDI will share them out. Um, they'll be then uh, retained for you all, so you can then share them with new advocates or advocates that aren't able to attend trainings, etc. And then there also are a few suggestions for community partners too, because we heard over and over that there were for that. And I also know that some of you are incredibly engaged in that community partner training and you are doing those things. And we want to make sure that like it's not just on you all who are also running many programs in your communities to do that community training. So if, you know, there are some of these other trainings that can be done by you all and can be recorded or by other consultants or by myself or whomever that may be, and then provided to your community partners, that might be a great option too. So these are just, again, ideas of how that could move through, and trainings could be implemented in your community. So that is a rundown of the Survivor Housing Action Plan. And again, I just want to say thank you so much for your time and your engagement in this process and everything that we learned and your willingness to let me pick your brains and ask the same questions over and over again. And it really was like a lovely thing to get to know you all and to engage with you this way. And I'm just really grateful for that. So I'm happy to answer any questions that I can. And I think maybe there are some questions in the chat.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for that beautiful rundown and for capturing all of our um, chats that way. I don't see questions yet, but folks, if you have questions or you want to drill down any further into any piece of this, we have time to do that. Does anybody want to unmute or chat? Any questions? I flagged in the chat that we are going, yeah, and you said too, Maria, that we're going to be doing some of these trainings, webinars. Oh, Maggie does have a question. So we have some trainings on the docket coming up. We have some with Maria and some with EOHLC through the Governor's Council Subcommittee on Housing, Training, and Collaboration Subcommittee. So we have a CHAMP training coming up in December. So the Executive Office for Housing and Livable Communities is going to go through the common housing application process uh, on Zoom, and we're going to record that. So that CHAMP training will be available. We'll have interpretation for that as well. And then we have, check my math, Maria. I think in January, we're going to be hosting you, right, for a domestic violence housing first training.
That's right. And we've taken the liberty to reframe it as housing first for survivors or housing first for DVSA
Yeah.
survivors, because it was the folks that really started the work in Housing First for survivors were rooted in the domestic violence movement, and they have said that they would do it differently now if they could. So we're just going to do it differently.
Yeah.
So please know that it's applicable across the board.
Yeah, we know that there are in both words and in reality, sometimes fewer options available for survivors of sexual assault and trafficking, right? And so that's what Maria's referencing is just to kind of expand that definition and those options. So yes, we will be sending out more information about that, but that will be in January. Um, I think the 8th, but we'll send out more details about that. And Maria mentioned doing some pre-recorded training, so some around kind of housing options. We have recorded trainings from earlier this fall around eviction sealing, around the law, and around some strategies for non-lawyer advocates supporting clients. Um, We have that Continuums of Care crash course that Maria did last week recorded. So I will send out, we don't have yet the beautiful housing hub that has been envisioned, but we do have a section in Coalition Manager of resources, and it's growing of housing resources. So we will send that out too. That's where we have materials. Our YouTube has all these videos uploaded. So we are working to make that a reality. I think those are the recordings so far and in planning, but are there others, Maria, that I'm forgetting?
I think that's what we have set out so far.
And certainly, so we'll share out I put a link in the chat to the action plan itself, but we'll share that out again. The last page of that has some of these trainings identified. Maria showed the slide that reflects that. But if there are trainings that you don't see there that you think either you and your colleagues would really like to see or housing partners in your community need, whether they would like to see them or you have identified that for them. We want to know that too. We want to know that. We want to raise that with the Governor's Council, Training and Collaboration Group. We want to be talking about that. So let us know. Are there other questions folks have? We'll share this out again, but I'm going to drop Maria's contact information and mine in the chat. You can always reach out. Maria, we have some gratitude in the chat, so I just wanted to say that for you.
Oh, that's kind. Thanks. Um, Please feel free, if you all have questions, to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any questions about this, but I'm also happy to answer any questions that you have when you're working with survivors. I do have some availability in my time with you all to do that work, and so happy to provide that. Um, and we're, getting word that that might become more valuable in the upcoming days, as the federal government reopens and all of that. I think that we're going to see housing applications from HUD reopen and those sorts of things. So,
Yeah, I think several of you, as I'm looking at this list, have Continuums of Care, COC funding, and so we will continue to be in touch with you all as we are seeing that probably NOFA will be released in the next couple of days, right? We think maybe, and so we'll be in touch about that. And also, if you see something or hear something from your COC, we'd love to be kept in the loop. But that's one of the things that Maria is referencing. And yes, as part of our contract, Maria is available for technical assistance. And I think people have had really great outcomes from that. So I want to plug that. Feel free to reach out to me and I can connect you or reach out to Maria directly. Yeah. I don't see any other questions, but we are available. So we will send out these materials. This is really, as Maria was sharing, this is really like uh, the beginning of the next step, not really like the end. It's an end product, but it's really a launch pad for us to go forward in this work. And so the landscape is uncertain and still we know what we need to do. And so some of this work is impacted by federal and state realities, and some of it is just ours to own. And so we're going to do what we can to keep each other moving forward and to keep survivors safe. So really grateful, Maria, for synthesizing and leading us on the adventure. If any of those of you that were in those spaces know that it was really a wonderful time to come together, and we want to do that again too, to be in community. But hope that this community continues to grow, and we will be listening to the outcomes of this action plan. So we're going to start taking action, and are really grateful to you all and to Maria for doing that with us. All right. Well, stay tuned for a note from us. And otherwise, I hope you have a really wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you all so much.